Welcome everyone to the NACAA 365. I'm David Marison, and I currently have the pleasure of serving as the Ag Issues National Committee Chair. And one of the goals of the Ag Issues Committee this year was to be able to host a webinar to talk about the 2020 Farm Bill. And of course, we're still waiting for the Farm Bill, but we'd like to welcome you to today's program. We're just really excited to have you join us here. And this program will feature Dr. Brad Lubben, who's an Extension Associate Professor and Policy Specialist and Director from the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Before I formally introduce Brad, I want to just remind you of a couple of Zoom protocols as we go through today's program. Today, if you have a question, we'll have time at the end to ask those questions, but if it's a question as we move through, don't hesitate to drop that into the chat feature. I'll be monitoring those as we go along today and then asking those questions to Brad. I think we have an excellent presentation from Dr. Lubben, a complete primer. So you'll learn about the different titles, the different program details by title, and then Brad will talk about the different major policy issues and hurdles that are impacting this passage of the new Farm Bill and what the timeline for passage of the Farm Bill looks as we look into the future. And again, we'll have that Q&A feature at the end. I do have the slides as a PDF. I haven't figured out how to drop those into the chat, but if I can, I will drop those in the chat. If I don't get that figured out by the end of today's program, don't hesitate to drop us an email either to NACA, to Scott Hawbaker, or myself, David Marison, at marison.2@osu.edu. We'll drop those into the chat as well, and we'll get the PDF of that. So I'd like to formally introduce to you Dr. Brad Lubben. I consider Brad a really good friend. He is a great policy expert who has 30 years of experience in teaching, research, and extension, and focusing on ag policy and ag economics. He's worked in the states of Illinois, Kansas, and Nebraska. Expertise again includes federal farm policy, ag policy development, ag risk management education. He grew up on a grain and livestock farm near Burr, which is southeast of Lincoln, Nebraska, and holds a BS and a master's degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a Ph.D. from Kansas State University. And Scott, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, and I think it would be really interesting for our NACA members, since this is open to NACA members from across the country, and we are recording it for those that couldn't attend today live, but they'll be able to watch it later. You have a connection to NACA, and maybe we'll start there, and if you could give that, and we'll give you the ability to share your slides, and maybe as an intro, talk about your time and your connection to NACA. Welcome.
David, thank you very much. Let me initiate the share. Okay, sharing is up. Hopefully things are working there. So
Looks great.
fantastic. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join and be part of this. I have looked through a few names as we were waiting to start. I recognize a few familiar names from across the country, but I see so many names that I haven't had the pleasure to meet. And that means I hope that we're reaching a great wide spectrum of professionals across the country, members of NACAA. And yes, I was a member of NACA for an early part of my career at Illinois and at Kansas State University. I was a young postmaster's grad that started in an extension position in Illinois back in '92. And the Illinois Extension Agents Association was one of the first great professional development opportunities I had. And by sort of quirk of timing and fate, I had the opportunity very early in my career to play a little role in service, and I actually served on the board first as a regional vice director, and then as a regional director for the North Central region. I served on the board back in 1997 and 1999, at a time when I got to meet Scott Hawbaker for the first time as an opportunity, and eventually as someone who came on board to be the executive director for NACAA. And so there is a long lineage that I'm proud of and thankful for with NACAA, and for the continued role of education and professional development. I might also mention, as you look at least my title slide there, another connection and another opportunity that many of you I expect have taken advantage of, and I hope everybody considers it. And that is that I'm the director of the North Central Extension Risk Management Education Center. That is one of 4 regional centers across the country. Each of those regional centers runs a regional competitive grants program for producer-focused risk management education. And when we talk about risk management, we're talking about a very broad spectrum of production and marketing and financial and legal and human risks. And so many things that extension professionals do for producers certainly fit in this definition of risk management education. And there are funding opportunities and educational opportunities as well. We just returned from our national conference early this month that was held in Nashville. There are great sort of capacity building opportunities like that, and certainly our regional annual call for grants for funding. So there are opportunities that I want to make sure you're aware of. Our ERME program tries to have a presence at the NACAA meeting each year, but I want to take every opportunity I have here to mention that for you as well. You can find that national website at extensionrme.org. The very bottom of my cover page there says ncerme.org. That's our North Central regional website. So I will reference all that. If you've already gotten adjusted to the red hue of the background here, I know David came on and he was wearing a shirt with an O, and I come on and I'm wearing a shirt with an N. So I am proud of my Nebraska roots as well. And in my 30 plus years in extension, I've had the opportunity to grow up and graduate in Nebraska, but to work in Illinois, to work at Kansas State, and to have the opportunity to come home for going on 20 years here back at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So one of the things we do, amongst others, is our work that in the ag economics and farm management space shows up on a center website, and we have the Center for Agricultural Profitability, which is conveniently acronymed CAP. So that other website at the bottom of the screen says cap.unl.edu. It's our foray and home for many of the resources and educational efforts that we roll out for producers as well. So I make reference to those couple of things to certainly show you there's information out there, and there's some great opportunities out there that I would encourage you to look at. If ever you want to contact me directly, my email there at brad.lubben@unl.edu. Certainly, please contact me, and I look forward to visiting. So I've been tasked with, as David asked me originally, to provide a Farm Bill update. And as I talk about an update of where we're at with the Farm Bill, it's kind of hard to explain where we're at if you don't talk about how we got here. And thus it eventually becomes more of a primer on what is the Farm Bill and what are the big issues and what are the challenges that we have. And so if I started with this discussion of what is a Farm Bill, and I tried to explain what it was, the first sort of short summary is that it's more than just the farm. We call it a Farm Bill. It never really has that official title in legislation, but we call it the Farm Bill. But the farm portion of the Farm Bill generally is sort of the commodity title, the crop insurance title, because those are the direct safety net programs for producers. The conservation title certainly matters, and other parts of all of the other titles are relevant. But we think about sort of the farm portion of the Farm Bill, and yet you look at that broader list there, and those are all the titles of the most recent Farm Bill back from 2018. And it is a broad, comprehensive bill. It's an omnibus bill by purpose. On purpose, it draws in programs and stakeholders and support from across a broad spectrum. And we'll sort of talk through that as it affects how farm policy unfolds. If I think about where we stand, this is the one slide that sort of says, where are we at with an update? Well, we're overdue, right? We know that. The 2018 Farm Bill technically expired back in September of 2023. We passed a one-year extension to move the debate into 24. We did not accomplish much in 24, except for the House Ag Committee, which actually did move a farm bill through markup and passed it out of committee. It didn't go further. The Senate did not move any language, but finally introduced some language near the end of the year after the presidential elections, after the general elections were over. Never an opportunity to imagine that it was going somewhere, but you finally saw outgoing Senate Ag Committee Chair Debbie Stabenow's vision of what a farm bill might be. Well, late in the year, we passed another farm bill extension, which pushes the debate into 25. That legislation also included some ag disaster and economic assistance that sort of almost usurps the call for getting a farm bill done in a timely way. But that's the status. That's really where we stand at present. If we think about trying to get to the finish line, then we should back up and think about the issues that seem to drive the policy debate time and time again. It is always a function of economics, and the economics of the times matter. And when this farm bill debate started, we had record farm income and near record commodity prices, or at least very strong commodity prices. By the time this farm bill actually comes to fruition, if and when it comes to fruition, we have a very different economic climate. And that changes some of the things that we're sort of pushing for or holding out for at the end. The federal budget also matters, or at least we assume it matters, and it affects the baseline, the choices that can be made, and the trade-offs that have to happen between spending. But then we also see ad hoc spending, and we have questions about what's in the formal farm bill and what's sort of coming in an ad hoc way. Trade also matters. Historically, more so that our trade commitments uh, generally provide constraints on what we can feasibly do with farm policy. But we're also in a new let's call it exciting, but certainly uncertain era of trade, where where we don't know how significant or how important trade is, or we the developments on the trade side impact the choices that we might make on the farm policy side. And of course, politics matters as well. And we have seen sort of the results of politics sort of getting in the way of pragmatism here over the past couple of years of envisioning what a farm bill could be that gets to the finish line, but never actually having a path to get there. So those are the challenges, some of the issues that we face. Now let's dig into them a bit more, particularly as it relates to the budget, because this farm bill debate to this point has really been shaped by and clouded by some debate on major proposals that have major budget consequences. And I've grouped them into four things here, but fundamentally a continued fight, or at least a debate, on directions for the commodity title and general proposals for increases in safety net support. We also have a debate about conservation, and specifically about some of the additional funding that was provided through the Inflation Reduction Act and its focus on climate. We also have, not surprisingly, a major battle over nutrition assistance. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that shows up in the nutrition title of the Farm Bill. And we have a battle about ad hoc spending, which really doesn't show up in the Farm Bill, but has almost become the primary source of federal support to producers in the last few years. And battles about how much there is and where that authority lies, and what sort of constraints might be put on it. So if you think about the Farm Bill debate we're in and the drivers of that debate and the general sort of calls that we've seen from different stakeholders, these are the battles we've been facing for the last couple of years. Of this is where the major money gets spent. If you're going to propose a change, these tend to be the issues that you have to identify and focus on to figure out how to pay for any changes. So a little more detail. If we think about the safety net, the commodity program, and more broadly, the safety net of commodity programs and crop insurance, and we think about the economic setting we're in, I mentioned earlier that economics seems to drive the debate. Well, every farm bill that I've sort of observed and sort of analyzed as a professional seems to have its own unique story. And there's not enough time here to tell a full story, but there are farm bills written for times of low prices, and challenges for farm income. And those farm bills tend to focus on how big of a safety net is needed. There are other farm bills that have been written in times of higher prices and maybe promises of new demand growth and export opportunities. And those farm bills seem to be written more for the era of how to get out of the way of producers to facilitate them succeeding in the marketplace, or to change how the safety net works to be relevant to them in a new era. Particularly the 1996 Farm Bill, the 2008 Farm Bill, even the 2014 Farm Bill were sort of written for a continuation of good times and changes in programs that became more relevant under good times. But some of the other bills were written more for the era of how strong of a safety net do we need in the bad times. And as I mentioned here, look to 2025, the last bar in the chart. Is this a good time or a bad time? Well, if you look at income from the marketplace, the blue bars, we are down substantially from the record farm income back in 2022. If you count the ad hoc assistance that is expected to come to producers this calendar year because of the legislation passed in December, we may actually be near a record farm income for 2025. And so it's a dichotomy of what economic climate are we really in? The headlines are talking about lower commodity prices and sticky production cost, which means a focus on safety net, but the economics aren't exactly all in line with that same story. This is the story that I hear. If you look at a comparison of commodity prices versus input costs, this is a chart I have borrowed or stolen one version or another from Dr. Seth Meyer, the USDA chief economist, who presented this at the Ag Outlook meeting back in February. But it's a nice illustration of an input price index in red versus the output price index, the crop sector index in green. And you can see different eras there where we've seen substantial uptick in commodity prices. The mid 2000s, perhaps on the ethanol boom and strong demand growth. The 2011-12 period where commodity prices moved higher in part on some short crop and strong demand opportunities. And then the era of sort of the post-COVID rally that started in mid second half of 2020 and really carried us through late 2022. When prices move up, costs tend to move up. When prices fall back, costs not so quickly, or at least input prices not so quickly. Now, this chart is only comparing input prices versus output prices. It doesn't directly compare revenues versus costs because it doesn't count for productivity. But this is the headline. This is the concern, the focus on and the need for a safety net in a tightening margin. And so this is the kind of farm bill debate that happens time and time again. What kind of safety net do we need? If I'm looking at what's in it and what is likely to be in it going forward, it's actually crop insurance that's probably first and foremost. Almost all ag groups will identify crop insurance as their number one priority. But some form of a commodity program, revenue safety net or price safety net is also right there. That income support's critical and continues to be a valuable component for producers. There is a marketing loan program for those program commodities as well. At some points, in the past, it has offered income support. It is so far below the market, we don't expect it to offer any sort of support that way, but it does offer some short-term cash flow for producers. There are the supplemental crop insurance programs that have been added over the last few years now. So we could lump that into crop insurance as a foundation in general, but there are some supplemental policies that have been developed and have been recommended for some changes as well. And then there is the ever-present disaster assistance. Part of that is authorized in the Farm Bill and permanently available. The livestock forage disaster program, the livestock indemnity program, the emergency assistance program for livestock, honeybees, and farm-raised fish, which conveniently has the acronym of ELAP, which doesn't correspond very well, but thankfully we just call it ELAP. Those programs have been authorized specifically in the Farm Bill of 2014, and they're there and they stay there. The other disaster assistance programs like crop disaster assistance and economic assistance have been ad hoc. And while they're not part of the Farm Bill, they have sort of become part of the expected safety net that producers look to. So thinking about what's in the Farm Bill, Title I is commodities. Title 11 is crop insurance. Things of note here. We're typically talking in Title I about commodity support for a specific set of program commodities. So not every commodity, particularly not specialty crops, not fruits and vegetables, but generally every grain and oil seed, cotton, rice, peanuts, etc. So we have the basic support there. We also have dairy programs in there as well. Um, uh, there are very few people that fundamentally really understand dairy policy. It is that complex, but there are dairy support programs as well. That's where the disaster programs are permanently authorized. And then we have non-insured assistance program. That is a FSA administered program that producers can use to effectively sign up for catastrophic protection on commodities that don't have crop insurance available. The short answer. Okay. That's the commodity program generally that we know. The crop insurance program, interestingly enough, in the Farm Bill doesn't authorize crop insurance. That's already authorized through separate legislation with permanent authority. So the Farm Bill doesn't authorize crop insurance, but it gets lumped into the debate because oftentimes the Farm Bill makes proposed additions, or changes to some of the crop insurance provisions. And that's where have been recommendations about upping the support levels for the supplemental insurance programs as an example. So just recognize that that's sort of the safety net discussion that happens within a Farm Bill. And there are details about how the commodity programs work, the ARC program, the PLC program. I'll leave that to the slides. There are plenty of fact sheets. There's plenty of educational efforts in virtually every state to give more detail to how those programs work. But an interesting perspective of how they have played out over time. If you look at corn as one example, I am in the Cornhusker state, so corn is my example. But if you look at corn, producers had to make decisions about enrolling in commodity programs. Producers that have base acreage have this opportunity to participate in commodity programs. If they had base acres in corn, they had a decision to make about enrolling in ARC, the Agricultural Risk Coverage Program that covers revenue, or PLC, the Price Loss Coverage Program that covers price. In 2014, when the 2014 Farm Bill implemented these new programs, producers had a choice. And the chart up here really sort of gives you an example of how those choices compared. In 2014, the Price Loss Coverage Program had a safety net that triggered at $3.70 a bushel. The Agricultural Risk Coverage Program was tied to a moving average revenue, which is a combination of moving average price and moving average yield. Well, the moving average price was substantially higher. And when the ARC program implements a guarantee tied to 86% of that average, a moving average yield times a moving average price times 86% gave you effectively gave you a revenue guarantee. If you take 86% of that price, you sort of got a price guarantee, assuming average yields. Okay, lots of assumptions in there, but it gave us a comparison. In 2014, producers had to think about programs that offered either a 370 safety net for corn or effectively a 455 safety net for under the ARC program. They chose wisely, and overwhelmingly producers signed up for ARC. Same story held true for soybeans, lesser extent for wheat and grain sorghum in the plains. And then you have the commodities in the South. Not cotton, which had to get out of the commodity program at that point, but for rice and peanuts, the price safety net was more relevant and they overwhelmingly chose PLC. Okay, but that was the decision in 2014. That was a one-time decision for the life of that Farm Bill. And so we made a major educational effort across the country and geared up and delivered education about that decision. The next time producers had that decision was when the 2018 Farm Bill passed, and there was a new decision for 2019 and 2020 combined. But look on that same chart. By that point, market prices had fallen, which means the average price had fallen, which means that the protection in the revenue program effectively had fallen. And in 2019 and 2020, the price protection program was still 370. The revenue protection program was effectively around 318. Now, which one did they choose? They're smart. They do the analysis and they switched. Overwhelmingly went from ARC to PLC. Now, since that time, we, at least in corn, have seen producers shift back towards ARC. Arguably, higher prices translate into expectations of higher guarantees in ARC, but it takes time. More likely, the last 4 to 5 years, higher prices meant that neither ARC nor PLC really had much of a likelihood of triggering based on price. And so at least the yield component of the ARC program offered some more support. That's the story I can tell about corn and soybeans. Cotton is now back in the program, not as cotton, but as seed cotton. And so seed cotton and rice and peanuts are still overwhelmingly price safety net participation because of the expected support that they get from those programs. So it's almost like there's two safety nets. There's one safety net that sort of looks like it works better in corn soybean country. There's another safety net that looks like it works better in cotton, rice, and peanut country. And wheat sort of, and grain sorghum even sort of both play between the two. Okay. That's a story about producer decisions. Maybe the summary of the safety net is just to remember it's complicated. It always is. Producers now face that decision every year, but they don't just make a farm program decision every year like the acronyms in green. They make a crop insurance decision every year, the acronyms in black. And those decisions sort of overlap in terms of what they cover and how they protect. And that's part of the education that producers need on an annual basis. Okay. To carry that through to the Farm Bill debate itself, what really matters right now, if you think about what producer groups are asking for in terms of Farm Bill support, there is this push for higher support levels in the commodity program, higher reference prices, higher protection levels in the ARC program, and also some higher support in the crop insurance program. But this dichotomy between a revenue program here versus a price program there, I think sort of boils down to this chart. As complicated as it might look, if you take market prices divided by the reference price, divided by that price safety net trigger, calculate a ratio, and then chart those ratios over the last 20 plus years. When commodity prices moved dramatically higher in the 2000s, that carried corn and soybeans and grain sorghum, and to a lesser extent wheat, to new highs. It also meant that the safety net levels in the Farm Bill were sort of left behind and less relevant and not providing much for support. At the same time, cotton, rice, and peanuts saw some higher price levels, but never dramatically above where that price safety net kicked in. And so when we offer this price versus revenue choice in the 2014 Farm Bill, we're coming off of an era when price looks almost irrelevant for some commodities. Price protection looks irrelevant for some commodities, but looks very important for others. And that's the kind of sign-up difference we saw in 2014. Move on to more recent years. We've had another run-up in prices in this post-COVID rally. Again, corn and soybeans and sorghum and wheat, and to a much lesser extent, cotton, rice, and peanuts. So it could be that this difference in preference between price versus revenue is a function of, well, the markets have favored stronger prices in some of the commodities like corn and soybeans versus cotton, rice, and peanuts. And that's why there are different preferences and fights over which safety net to improve. I could also make an argument, and that first argument is probably based on corn and soybeans have enjoyed outsized rallies compared to other commodities, and that's probably a function of biofuels policy and the demand growth that comes from there. I could also make another argument that maybe the support levels for cotton, rice, and peanuts were always high relative to their underlying market conditions. And that might be a function of decades of power on the agricultural committees in Congress. I could tell both of those stories. I could probably make a solid argument that both of those stories are true. It's a combination of things that gives us the debate that we see today. But even then, it's worth noting about the longer run picture of this. And so I divert from the Farm Bill itself to a discussion of the broader ag economy or the broader ag production sector. If I look at total growth in farm productivity over time, indexed back here to 1950, our productivity has grown about 3 times in that 70-year period. We're producing 3 times as much as we did 70 years ago with really the same level of inputs today. A little more purchased inputs, a little more capital, a lot less labor, and a little less land. Index that overall inputs have been relatively stable. Outputs have grown 3 times, thus productivity has grown effectively 3 times. Well, I chart productivity growth here against population growth because if you sort of accept generally that productivity growth represents the growth in supply, that's the shift in the supply curve moving out. Population in the United States represents effectively demand in a mature, stable, generally stable economy. It's population growth that gives us new food demand, ag demand growth. Well, if productivity is growing faster than population, or at least it has to this point, then in other words, supply is growing faster than demand. If supply grows faster than demand, prices go down. And in real terms, commodity prices have been falling for the better part of 70 years. There are peaks. We're on a little bit of an uptick, or we were on a little bit of an uptick here in the last couple of years. But relative to history, we're down dramatically. And this is simultaneously the greatest success story of the U.S. ag production sector. Lower real prices means increased affordability, better standard of living, et cetera. But it's simultaneously the greatest success story of the U.S. ag production sector, and also the thing that every farmer complains about at the coffee shop every morning. And so this focus on price, this focus on the need for a safety net is always with us. Okay, enough about the safety net for now. Let's think about the other parts of the bill and the other parts of the debate. The conservation title, think about the big portfolio of programs in the conservation title. Traditionally, land retirement programs like CRP, working lands programs, and I say including the Conservation Innovation Grant Program, because it's another reminder that there are some grant opportunities in conservation that extension might often play a part in too. There are the preservation programs and there are the partnership programs. If you think about total support for these programs, it's grown dramatically in the last 30 years. With the advent, the introduction of the CRP in the 1985 Farm Bill, and now the EQIP and CSP and other working lands programs, since we spend in excess of $4 billion, now closing in on $5 billion of expected payments to producers on an annual basis. So it's a substantial part of the government portfolio for producers. One note here about the CRP, because it's different than what we may have remembered it as. It was created in '85, and it was arguably in 1985 as much of a focus on trying to take land out of crop production as it was trying to protect land for environmental benefits. I have 25 years of data up there, and even in that 25-year period, you see a very dramatic shift. The light green is the general enrollment. That's the competitive enrollment that has to be bid into the program on a regular basis. We're waiting to see when and if the next general sign-up might occur. But that used to be the vast majority of the acreage in the program. Getting land out of production, getting it into environmental uses. The dark green bars at the bottom are the continuous enrollments. That is the high priority enrollment that doesn't have to compete in a bid, but has the opportunity to sign up on a continuing basis. That's the kind of enrollment, not for large fields, but for partial fields and specific targeted practices like buffer strips or pollinator habitat and various other priority needs. Then if you look, there is this interim or middle shade of green. That's the new grasslands provision. It's new in the sense of about the last decade, but the grasslands provision is officially part of the CRP, but it also looks more like a working lands program. It preserves land and grass, but it allows producers to manage for both haying and grazing purposes on that CRP acreage. Payments per acre are not nearly as big, but they're more of a stewardship payment than they are a rental payment to take land out of production because it still stays in production. That grassland portion is now the biggest single portion of the CRP. So the CRP historically we thought of as this gets land out of production with some limited haying and grazing allowed. Now it is a principal part of how that program works and the opportunities that it might have for producers. Okay. That's one sort of look back about how the conservation programs and the CRP have worked. This is the look at what really is the issue today. You have total spending on conservation programs across the broad portfolio. That's the solid bars at the bottom, along with the solid black bar that shows up there. That's what shows up in the baseline in terms of what we expect to spend and what is budgeted for extending a farm bill. Then there are the 4 years of additional spending authority, budget authority, and projected spending in the gray bar or the gray line. That's the IRA program spending. The Inflation Reduction Act provided nearly $20 billion of additional conservation money to spend on climate practices. Spend it through EQIP and CSP and the existing conservation programs, but spend it specifically on climate practices. Those program signups, those incentives have started to go out the door. That's added to total conservation spent payments to producers, but it's one-time money. And there was a debate about trying to get that one-time money turned into permanent money, or at least ongoing money in the core farm bill, but a simultaneous debate about if you move it into the farm bill proper, do you keep its focus on climate or do you relax that constraint and allow it to spread across other practices? That's a fundamental debate that, amongst other things, held up the farm bill last year. And so we continue to wonder where that'll go. We might think we're in a very different, I was going to use the word climate. I'm not sure that's right. We're in a very different sort of mode today, talking about climate and incentives or programs with the word climate in them. But fundamentally, this is still the debate relative to the farm bill. Ultimately, the conservation issue is this: some balance of environmental regulatory policy versus programs, whether compliance or incentives, versus potential market opportunities. And even there, some need for policy to define how those markets might work. That's the nugget that we have to solve eventually on conservation. One of the fights we're having about this farm bill is nutrition. And that's fundamentally about the SNAP program and the spending on the SNAP program. And for some reason, my pie chart doesn't show all the detail there. Wondering if it, but if I look at where farm bill spending is, these smaller slices are crop insurance, commodities, and conservation. That's sort of that farm portfolio that I talked about earlier. The red slice is nutrition, specifically SNAP. And literally everything else fits in that little blue, light blue slice, less than 1% of the total. So overwhelmingly, the farm bill budget is dictated by nutrition assistance, food assistance spending. And the fight is over how much spending and how does it work. Total spending has gone up dramatically. You can also see there that it tends to go up sharply, like it did in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, 2010, like it did during COVID. When it goes up sharply, it tends not to come back nearly as quickly, which is to say, we know how to expand the program. We maybe don't nearly as easily know how to bring it back after economic conditions start to improve. So that's one argument that says, oh, this is about total level of spending, and spending is through the roof. Well, spending is up because participation is up. Spending is up because benefits per participant have also gone up dramatically. And there's a whole policy debate there about those things. But it's also true that spending on SNAP and participation in SNAP tends to mimic the changes in poverty rates in the United States. We might think of, and at least historically, we've argued that SNAP is this temporary support for producer or for families, for households that are down on their luck. And that's sort of reflected in economic conditions and reflected in the unemployment rate. When economic conditions go down, unemployment rates go up, and SNAP participation should go up. But when economic conditions improve, theoretically, SNAP participation should go back down. Well, it turns out if you follow that chart, that it sure looks like SNAP tracks poverty much more closely than it tracks unemployment as some sort of economic indicator. Okay, that's a broader debate, but fundamentally, that's the fight over how much should we spend or how much shouldn't we spend on food assistance in the Farm Bill. Even then, I would say the bigger food policy debate is this. And again, it's sort of pushing off to another topic. But as much as we're fighting over a farm bill and deciding about how much should be spent or not be spent on food assistance, the bigger food policy question for agriculture is in that chart to the right there. Divide the U.S. Households into quintiles by disposable income. The lowest quintile, the lowest 20%, spend $5,000 plus on food in a year. And I don't know if that's full or if that's sort of net of food distribution and assistance, but 5,000 on food. But that 5,000 on food is about 33% of their disposable income. So tracked spending against the left axis, percent of the income on the right axis. Lowest quintile is spending about a third of their income on food. For reference, that's a similar spending rate as many developing countries. So we think about where food spending is and the role of food security. For the lowest quintile, even the lowest two quintiles of consumers in the United States, food security is fundamentally the question. But look over to the right, and the highest quintile consumer might spend as much as $17,000 on food in a year, but it only represents 7 or 8% of their disposable income. They have the luxury of spending whatever they want on food to consume whatever food they want in whatever form they want, in whatever setting they want, and getting whatever experience they want out of it. It's a very different kind of demand on the food system. And we see that play out in terms of, is this fundamentally an issue of food security, or is it an issue of, but how was my food raised? How was it processed? Where was it produced? How closely connected do I feel to the producer? And so on and so forth. Those are policy debates that are playing out not just in DC, but in every state house and in every border across the country. That's the food debate. All right, a very brief tour through the rest of the Farm Bill. This is all the stuff that fits in the other 1%. Not that it's not significant, but that's where it fits. Title III is trade. That's fundamentally about market development. It's the market promotion programs. It is not the broader trade negotiations. It is not the broader trade conflict and tariffs and retaliatory tariffs and reciprocal tariffs and so on and so forth. It is none of that issue. That's not a Farm Bill issue. In the Farm Bill specifically is the assistance programs that help to promote U.S. ag products and trade development. Title V is the credit program. That's where we see the federal loan programs administered through the Farm Service Agency. Ownership loans, operating loans, direct loans, guarantees, and so on and so forth. Actually, let me back up there to mention that is, I believe, also where you see the state ag mediation program support come from. So some of that support coming to states to run ag mediation, some of that support that goes towards funding grants for ag mediation. This is its fundamental source. Title VI in rural development. Rural development fundamentally in the Farm Bill is infrastructure, business development, community facilities. That's sort of the core responsibility of rural development. That is where value-added ag grant programs show up. So the value-added producer grant program, that's its home in rural development. It's where rural broadband shows up in the Farm Bill, although the major funding for rural broadband is coming from outside the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a significant but minor share of that total. Title VII is one that actually touches every one of us, and that's the research extension related title. That's the baseline dollars we see in Hatch and Smith Lever. That's the authorization for the competitive grants programs and everything else that we run through, including our own extension risk management education program that I mentioned earlier. So lots of opportunities there, but also the reality that we sort of live and depend on the debate and the direction of the Farm Bill. Title VIII is forestry. Very small title because we're not talking about broader forest management, even though the Forest Service is technically housed in the USDA. We're fundamentally talking in the Farm Bill about private woodland management and some of the stewardship programs for that. Title IX is energy. This is fundamentally grant and loan support. It's changed at different times, but it's fundamentally grant and loan support for biofuels or bio-based economic development. It is not the home of the renewable fuel standard. That entire energy debate and the biofuels markets and so forth are a function of other legislation and other regulatory responsibility at EPA. But within the Farm Bill, there's an energy title, or at least there has been, and more of a focus on some of the grant and investment funds. Title X is horticulture. We have to get all the way to Title X before we can start talking about crops that are not basic program commodities. All the fruits and vegetable crops fit here. They tend not to have support programs, direct supports. They tend to focus more on the block grants, the research programs, the promotion programs that help the industry along, as opposed to direct safety net support. That's where organic agricultural programs primarily lie. That's where a lot of the local foods programs, the farmers market programs, et cetera, all lie. It's also where hemp shows up, at least in terms of Farm Bill legislation. Just to mention, as noted there in that bullet, lots of things for specialty crops, horticulture, show up in other titles, but this is at least the home of major language for horticulture. And of course, every Farm Bill also has a miscellaneous, and interestingly enough, oftentimes this is the only place that livestock show up by name. Livestock producers generally are not part of Title I safety net programs, except for dairy, and except for the disaster assistance programs that they have. So those are there. Otherwise, livestock might often be a minor part of the discussion of conservation allocations for livestock or research initiatives and so forth. The livestock discussion that shows up in the miscellaneous title tends to be more about animal disease management, which is certainly a headline issue at the moment. Okay, that's lots of detail about what shows up in the Farm Bill. Let me sort of get close to a summary here with the fate of where we seem to be at the moment. And that is, for all this discussion of what's in a Farm Bill and how the debate on a Farm Bill unfolds, a lot of the discussion at the moment is about how major efforts are coming outside the Farm Bill. If you look at total farm program spending, farm program payments to producers over 50 plus years here, the yellow bars, the blue bars, those are traditional commodity program payments. The green bars are conservation program payments. And then you have the what, dark red, reddish orange, whatever color we call that. That's supplemental assistance program payments. That is the standing disaster assistance program. So some of that is authorized, but most of it's ad hoc. Some of it comes through congressional action. Some of it comes directly from the secretary. And to say that those payments have overwhelmed everything else for the last few years would almost be an understatement. I would say that ad hoc payments have trumped traditional payments, but that would be a poor pun to use, so I won't. Okay. But suffice it to say, ad hoc program spending has almost raised the question, as some of my colleagues have asked, do we really have a formal farm bill, or are we living year to year on ad hoc spending? And we have ad hoc spending for 25. That includes 21 billion in ag disaster assistance, 10 billion in economic assistance. The economic assistance payments have been rolled out already. There was a call to roll them out within 90 days of passage, and they did. And these are the expected payments per acre under those programs. There's actually a partial payment now of 85% of that number paid to producers, with the balance to be paid once total enrollment is considered. But fundamentally, there's substantial cash flow going out to producers now as a form of economic assistance, arguably as a form of providing some economic support to producers, given that they did not get a new farm bill with higher safety nets passed on time. That's the argument if you want to make an argument for them. But it is substantial cash flow now, $10 billion nationwide. The $21 billion nationwide actually has less detail to it, other than language that says implement this disaster assistance much as you did previously for assistance in 2020 and 2021. We have to see exactly how it rolls out, but it might roll out the way that the emergency relief program previously did. FSA has to develop rules, has to roll out the process. And so it may still be weeks or months away. That leaves us then thinking about where we go and the direction we go. And one chart here to acknowledge our new leadership in the ag committees, particularly the addition of 2 Minnesotans to the leadership. Representative Angie Craig takes over the Democratic side of the House Ag Committee from David Scott. Senator Amy Klobuchar takes over the Senate Ag Committee duties from Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. So you have a Minnesotan replaced a Michigander, you have a Minnesotan replaced a Georgian. It changes the makeup, it changes the chemistry of the Farm Bill process a little bit, for sure. That's the politics of getting to a bill this year. The optimism of getting there is kind of fuzzy. It's taken me 50 minutes to get to the point of saying, this is a Farm Bill update, and I don't think the update is that optimistic. Interestingly enough, look on the right there, the same day, a little over a month ago, the same day I got a Google News alert, and the first headline said, we're bullish on yet another extension. Okay, bearish on the Farm Bill. The next headline said, Thompson is optimistic about a Farm Bill. So even the news can't decide whether we're bullish or bearish here. Although I would note, Chairman Glenn Thompson is about the only person who has a right to be optimistic about a Farm Bill, because he is the only person that actually got a bill done in 2024, at least in House Ag Committee. So there is a pathway to get there, but it's still the same debate we have. And my last bullet on the left side says, Republicans control Congress and they control the White House. Obviously, that means they have control. They can move whatever they want, except that they can't necessarily even agree on their own, let alone agree to something across the aisle. And so trying to get to the final finish line is difficult. Which leaves us thinking, don't forget, there are other issues. The Farm Bill is critical. The Farm Bill is important. It may not even be the biggest issue on the radar for agriculture. Trade policy right now has taken over the headlines. Tax policy is among us. The Trump administration is looking to rewrite environmental regulatory policy. We have a continuing debate about energy policy, labor and immigration, and everything else. Lots of issues up there. We have so much uncertainty up there, which is a good way of saying there is so much we don't know. So leave it to economists to try and come up with a way to measure what we don't know. They have put together, a group of economists put together a measure of global policy uncertainty by tabulating headlines about uncertainty and tax policy and economic forecasts. By those measures of uncertainty, global policy uncertainty, we are at the highest levels we've seen. Congratulations, we live in challenging times. We live in uncertain times. That's the arena, that's the setting we're at for the Farm Bill debate. That's the setting we're at for every policy debate. And so So I present to you the challenges. Unfortunately, maybe not the answers. So, David, I'm going to pause it here. And well, that's the end here. And let me stop sharing to uh, bring back the main screen.
Great.
And I've run through quite a bit, so I'm happy to stay as long as anybody's willing to take answers or to take questions and answers. So,
So we have the opportunity here. Thank you, Brad. First, I'm going to ask you two questions, and that will give some time for to formulate um, some questions either in the chat, but because we're an open format here, you can also raise your hand and we can try to watch, and you can unmute yourself and ask your questions as well because we're all extension folks, so we know how this game works. I have an observation when you talked about SNAP benefits about the unemployment of being at a low level. It's interesting, and maybe you could make a comment on this. On the first question is one of the pushbacks to the states from Washington, D.C. has been that you need to get to make sure those that can work that are on SNAP benefits are working. So we heard that, I think
mhm.
that this week here in the state of Ohio. What's your thought on that when we have unemployment levels at where they're at based on the chart that you showed
Yeah,
versus about this kind of this promotion that you have to get people back to work?
yeah. Uh, you're right. I think that the fundamental debate about SNAP participation and the requirements for participation is an interesting one. Um, it's part of that broader debate. Is SNAP about assistance to help individuals in the short run to try to get them back to being productive participants in the nation's economy? Or is SNAP ultimately more of a long run safety net for households that are in poverty? And we can sort of see where those statistics tend to show. But the debate about SNAP spending has boiled down to uh, the growth in the program and the growth in payments have been exponentially higher. And so it is a massive federal program. It's about the only big bank account to really imagine cutting back and saving some money. But anytime you see a cutback, you have, not to be partisan here, but you have one side of the aisle that says any cut is taking food out of the mouths of hungry kids, to embellish the metaphor. But it's to take any cut is a cut in food for what are still food insecure households. But any spending also includes concerns about fraud, waste, abuse, eligibility criteria, work criteria. So there have been proposed reforms to try and reform the eligibility rules. There have been proposed reforms to try and reform the length of time that someone can be on assistance. There have been proposed reforms to try and tighten up the rules about actively seeking work and education. Uh, some of those on individual analysis, um, you know, may make logical sense, but in aggregate, any of those things ultimately reduce spending and reduce participation. And the response is, but that's food out of the mouths of hungry kids. So I'm sounding partisan, but it's as best I can describe what is fundamentally a partisan debate right now. Um, any attack on spending and participation is seen as food out of the mouths of hungry kids. But any promise of support for food insecure individuals is also seen as out of control growth in federal entitlement. And I yet do not see a resolution to that issue.
And my second question was, Brad, is do you see a path forward for the Farm Bill to pass this year? Or are we looking through another extension and we'll be talking about this again in 2026?
We could probably schedule it now and do it again. It is it is as challenging this year as it has been for the past 2 years, and we've seen what's happened. Um, there are parts of the Farm Bill that we see being discussed that we could move that via the reconciliation bill. The reconciliation bill doesn't need to go through regular order. It goes through this sort of accelerated process and doesn't need to survive a filibuster in the Senate. It only needs a majority vote. And so it's being seen as the vehicle to move the budget, to move some of the tax policy and potentially move some of the expiring components of the Farm Bill. Um, if it does, you could envision that that's where you move some reforms that are not politically popular across the aisle, and a Republican majority can do things that they can't do in regular order. So it's possible to move parts of the Farm Bill that way. If so, it's also possible to imagine parts of the Farm Bill sort of get left behind. And so we might see ideas to move commodity program changes, crop insurance changes, conservation changes, and food assistance changes, the four big budget categories, move them through reconciliation, and all of the other titles sort of get forgotten in the meantime, and have to live and die on their own later in the year in a regular bill. It's also possible that we try and move this as one big farm bill and find a way to get it done, or find a way to yet extend it at the end of the year. And
I
if
see.
if we extend it, if we get a new bill, or if we extend it, for lots of commodity producers, the differences might be subtle. We've had effectively the same ARC and PLC program now for the last 10 years. The numbers change each year based on adjustments in the formula, but the same basic program has now been in existence longer than about any commodity program in the history of the Farm Bill has lasted. So it's almost like we have our new permanent Farm Bill already with us.
I see our friend Heather from the great Dakotas is on. Go ahead, Heather. Just unmute yourself and ask your question. From
Well, thanks a bunch, Brad, and thanks for calling me a friend, David. I appreciate that. Better, it's the best thing I've been called all day.
yeah,
I think maybe you answered part of my first question just there, but the coffee shop a lot of times when you go talk to farmers is, hey, let's just separate this thing and get our part of the farm bill done and
Yep.
leave that food side to those that are worried about the food side part. Um, what's your good canned answer when we talk to those guys down at the coffee shop? So that's question number one. And question number two related to the CRP component. Did you say that the new version of that grassland CRP is the biggest part of the CRP program right now, even though you can still hay and graze those acres that are enrolled?
Yeah. Yes, let me give you the second answer there first. The
I thought
grassland
maybe that would be the
CRP,
easiest one.
yeah, yeah. Uh, the grassland CRP now has the largest share of acreage in the CRP. It's more than a third. They're roughly a third, and a third, but the grassland is actually number one. Those payment rates are smaller. They're $15 an acre, so they're not the biggest dollars going in the program, but they are the biggest number of acres. Um, the grassland CRP specifically has managed haying and grazing as effectively the standard practice. And that affects how producers can manage their cattle on that land, pay more attention to nesting season, pay more attention to habitat quality, perhaps, but it effectively allows protection of those acres while keeping them in production. The general CRP, those acres often are available for managed haying and grazing, not every year typically, but on a regular basis for a reduced rental rate. So we've had a little bit of working land type policies, managed haying and grazing already show up earlier, but now it's more formal in the grassland portion. Okay. So that's the CRP side. On the food assistance side, the SNAP discussion, uh, uh, the argument is that farm and food, or rural and urban, have been together for 50 plus years. Since the early 1970s, they've been together in a coalition to get a farm bill across the finish line. And it takes the support of both of them to get a a bipartisan agreement on a farm bill. And if we move a farm bill in regular order, it's hard to imagine it moving without bipartisan support. Because even though Republicans have control of all chambers, um, I would venture that there are Republicans, sort of mainstream Republicans, that agree more with some of their mainstream Democratic colleagues than they do with their far right Republican colleagues. In other words, getting a unanimous Republican caucus to agree on a farm bill may be more difficult than getting a bipartisan caucus of the middle to agree on a farm bill. So just because there's Republican control doesn't make it easier. It may mean that certain parts can move through reconciliation, but probably not the whole. So we're back to, so then how does the whole move? It's hard to imagine the whole moving without bipartisan support, which comes back to, it's not just rural, or it's not just Republican versus Democrat, it's more rural versus urban, farm versus food. And the statistic that probably nails that down is, if we tried to separate them, and we've tried before to do so, if we tried to separate them, there are about 50, I'm being generous, there are about 50 House districts in the entire country where agriculture is far and away the leading economic driver. You don't have enough quote unquote ag representatives to fundamentally get something out of committee, let alone across the finish line in the House. On the other hand, there are about 200 plus representatives that represent districts where ag is minimal, urban and suburban districts that all have a farmer, at least according to ag census data, but where ag as an economic driver is minimal. They have a lot more ties to the food assistance than they do to the farm assistance side of the farm bill. It'd be much easier to imagine a food assistance bill gets across the finish line than a farm bill gets across the finish line. Thus the idea of, yes, they are the big brother in the room, but if you don't take big brother, you don't get to go.
I think I like that part the best. Almost every district's got people that we're trying to feed. Not every district has the ag side that's
As
looking for that
farmers that we're
safety
trying to
net.
support. Yeah,
Yep. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
you bet, Heather.
Okay, are there other questions from across the country? Brad, I just wanted to remind everybody that if there's anybody, raise your hand real quick or put it in the chat real quick. If not, we're going to close today's program, but the slides are in the chat. Thank you to Jim Downs from Ohio State for putting those up and putting a quick go link so that you're able to access those. Also wanted to remind folks, I also put in the link that you can rewatch this webinar or any of the other great NACA 365 webinars over the last couple of years on that link that I put there into the chat box as well. And also, Brad, if they want to get a hold of you, again, just the easiest is brad.lubben@unl.edu, and able to converse with you. Appreciate, Brad, just your explanation of the different titles, thinking about where we're going on the Farm Bill, and the fact that here you are, an NACA member at your roots, coming on today to share with you your expertise about the Farm Bill. And maybe we will be back in a year from now talking about the 2026 version, but we'll let this play out and see how that goes. And I don't know if you have any final comments before we log off, but I want to say thank you from the NACA Ag Issues Committee and all the members of NACA across the country.
Well, David, I'll just say thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute back to an organization and a professional association of colleagues that I hold dear to my mission here. So great to visit with you, at least virtually here, and look forward to whatever I can provide in terms of further insight and assistance, as well as the likelihood that, hey, new farm bill or not, producers will face new decisions every year. And so the educational mission will never stop.
Well said, well said. Well, thank you everybody for being on today's program. And just reminder, if you have any want to explore more about NACA and the opportunities in our AMPIC that's coming up, just go to naca.com, and appreciate Scott Hawbaker for all the work that he does behind the scenes to make our organization such a success. Thank you, everybody.